Okay, I think I'm gonna get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's installment of the Funga Speaker Series. It's going to be a great one. My name is Ian Ware, calling in from Missoula, Montana today. I'm our head of applied science at Funga, where we rewild fungal biodiversity for forests, people, and the climate. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Sara Kuebbing. Uh, Dr. Kuebbing is a research scientist and director of the Yale Applied Science Synthesis Program. Had to write that one down just to make sure I got through it. In the Forest School at the Yale School of the Environment. Dr. Kuebbing's research focuses on how humans can make informed decisions on how to best protect and conserve landscapes, ecosystems, and all the species that live within them. Something that we think about a good bit at Funga. Before I kick off to Sarah, a couple housekeeping things. Let's please save our questions for the end. Our very own Will Gardner will facilitate our Q&A at the end. Will's waving if you can't see him. And then during the Q&A, please feel free to raise your hand or put your question in the chat and we'll get to it. And without any further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Ian and Funga team for the invitation. Let me just get things started here. That should work. All right. Can everyone see my slides? Perfect. Great. All right. So this is really exciting to get to present to you all. And hopefully I will have enough time to put together all the slides that I wanted to put together for this incredible team. But yeah, my name's Sarah, and I direct a research program at the Forest School at the School of the Environment, called the Yale Applied Science Synthesis Program. And as Ian just said, our goal is really broad to sort of continue on the ethos of the Forest School here, which is to make sure that there are strong connections between land management science and actual applied land management. And so a lot of times, though, we try to distill down sort of what we do, which you can read all about on the website, is our real goal is sort of helping people make decisions. That is like at the core what we want to do here at the Applied Science Synthesis Program. And we really specifically want to help people make decisions about how they manage their ecosystems. And we've moved sort of beyond just thinking about forests to thinking about agro ecosystems and wetlands and grasslands, because these ecosystems continue to provide a lot of important services that we value, ranging from protecting biodiversity to providing sort of food, fuel, and fiber, to cleaning our air and water and providing a spiritual and cultural respite. And so we think broadly about a lot of these, but today, since Funga invited me, and also because it's what the world is talking about, we're spending a lot of time thinking about how these ecosystems capture and store carbon and how we can both manage the ecosystems, but then also measure what's happening within those ecosystems. And so we've spent a lot of time over the last 4 years as we've been building this program thinking about sort of the subset of things called nature-based solutions. And this is a term that really exploded as soon as the IUCN and the World Bank coined the term back in 2009. And it's just taken off as this really compelling way to meet these global, both environmental and sustainability goals, where people really want to know, how do we manage nature in a way that we can provide food for people, we can provide communities with economic resources, we can protect biodiversity, but we can also mitigate and solve climate change. And of course, probably everyone here, but just to like ground us in like the extreme challenge over the next decade that we need to have, is that we are really in crunch time now. The latest IPCC 6 assessment report told us that we've really waited too long, that if we want to keep warming under ideally 1.5, which we unfortunately hit last year as a global average temperature. So in reality, we're already thinking about this 2-degree threshold of warming. We've got a long way to go from policies that we've implemented to any of these mitigation pathways where we keep global temperatures down. And so the IPCC has like really clearly told us there's basically 3 things that we need to be doing. And there's no fighting over this in terms of what we should be doing. We actually need to be doing all 3 of these things right now at full scale. But broadly, like any pathway that's going to keep us to our mitigation outcomes is significantly reducing any fossil fuel emissions from oil, coal, and gas. We also need to reduce land-based emissions because we have a lot of land emissions, especially in the form of methane and nitrous oxides on our croplands. We need to neutralize those emissions, and then we need to start removing carbon dioxide. And that's both through managing our lands better, like some of the work that Funga does, but also through more technological removals or other landscape removals where we're, deploying volcanic dust out onto croplands to enhance weathering processes, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in the end. Um, and so we also know we have like a lot of options of what we can do. And so this is directly from the summary for policymakers in the IPCC 6 assessment report, where they write several mitigation options, notably improved forest and crop grassland management are technically viable, are becoming increasingly cost effective, and are generally supported by the public. So we have this like broad menu of things that we know what we need to do. We just need to start acting on them to reach these mitigation goals. Um, but unfortunately, and this is nice, here's a World Economic Forum slide for some of your Funga colleagues who are at the World Economic Forum. We are not on target. We are still not on target to meet these goals. And so if you look at current pledges, this is back from 2021, but I don't think much has changed. If we sort of look at no climate policy scenarios, we were in this 4 degrees climate scenario. If we look at current policies, we're still looking at 3 degrees of peak warming. If we put in pledges and targets like nationally determined contributions and other big targets that we've set, we're at 2.5 degrees. And all of these are above what the Paris Agreement and what the UN and the signatories said of 2 degrees. So we have this sort of mitigation gap issue where even with all the current pledges and where we're at, we actually still are not on a 2 degrees pathway. And so the big question that we all need to be asking ourselves is like, what is going to fill this mitigation gap? And I'd love to say that it was going to be US policy, but we're actually widening the mitigation gap. And so I think that gives a lot of impetus for thinking about things like the voluntary carbon market as being a tool to fill this mitigation gap where we don't see things coming in. But unfortunately, we've seen some rough times over the past, 5 years in carbon markets. And so this is from the Forest Trends Ecosystem Marketplace. Actually, it's their 2025 report that just came out, but it really tracks sort of this idea of these sales of carbon credits in annual volume peaking and going up in 2021 and then sort of collapsing back down. And so this is not maybe the trend that we want to see. If we want to fill that mitigation gap with something like voluntary carbon credits, this isn't the right trend to be fulfilling those goals. And so we can sort of ask ourselves, well, okay, well, what's going on? Like, what was this like surge in carbon credits and then collapse? And I think there's a lot of effort that coming out of the Paris Agreement in 2015 and coming with the IPCC's 6 assessment report, we actually had a lot of buy-in from a lot of different groups, but like municipalities, states, regions, other sub-jurisdictions, along with countries that were making pledges and commitments to net zero. We have cities that across the world that were making commitments, and a lot of corporations that were making all these net zero pledges to mitigate climate change and to help achieve Paris Agreement climate goals. And so I think we saw this big surge in interest in volume of carbon credit sales. But then we saw this massive decline, and this was about the time when I like stepped into thinking about carbon markets and started this position. And so there was a lot for me to catch up on. But I think like John Oliver had his, sort of crash course on additionality online about the year that I started, where all of a sudden, as people were more interested in carbon credits and using carbon credits to mitigate climate change and to help corporations meet their net zero goals, a lot of academics and journalists were starting to question the methods and the approaches that were underpinning all of these carbon credits and starting to, make some really big claims that were really damaging about offsetting and greenwashing and issues. And so following this, we are still seeing sort of market fallout where this is percent change again, just from 2022 to 2023 across all different kinds of carbon credit programs, where both the volume and the value of these credits are going down. And so again, if we're trying to fill a mitigation gap, this is not the trend to fill that gap. And so we can see, generally forests make up one of the largest sectors of carbon credit sales. And so we can see that while sales are generally going up, they are really declining sort of on the year on change for forestry and land use. And then in another area in agriculture, we can also see that we're actually seeing some surge in volume, but loss in value, where people are trying to mitigate doing emissions reductions and carbon capture in the agricultural land spaces. And so sort of watching that surge, our group has been thinking about lots of questions. And so today I just want to talk about three projects that we're either working on or have just closed out that are really about increasing our confidence in these forest and soil carbon accounting protocols and how we measure them and feeling confident that what we're measuring is actually leading to climate change mitigation. And so I just want to talk about these three projects. The first is thinking about addressing this fundamental problem of causal inference, which is true for not just ecosystem carbon accounting, but almost any carbon accounting that we're doing, even if we're talking about pure technological or energy sector switches. I then want to talk about a project that we just finished up last year, this idea of sort of really challenging these protocols using these protocol intercomparison projects to evaluate the methods, the ecosystem carbon accounting methods that we're using. And then I'm going to share some work from a PhD student here at Yale who is on the call today, Kira Biener, who is doing this really neat empirical study that I want to share with you all that's thinking about stacking nature-based solutions, and in particular, the interplay between tree planting, addition of basalt rocks for enhanced weathering, and then fungal inoculants to look and see if we can actually see synergistic interactions as we start to stack these practices together on the landscape. Okay, so I want to start with this idea of addressing the fundamental problem of causal inference in ecosystem carbon accounting. And this is something that, again, has really blown up in terms of forest carbon credits, but is something that all carbon credits really need to think about and play with. And so just to introduce this concept of causal inference, I'm going to contextualize it with these pictures of what we call old fields. And here's one from Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which I know folks on this call are familiar with. And then here's one from up in sort of my neck of the woods where I am now in Shelter Island, New York. And these are just open agricultural fields or pasture lands, and they're really common throughout the eastern United States, and they're common legacies in a lot of areas in the globe. And here in the eastern United States, these old fields are really a legacy of this extensive wave of deforestation and forest harvest that started in the 17th century and went on through the early 20th centuries, where we can see this wave of where we used to have, oh, sorry, guys, clearly don't know how to use this. Where we can see we had extensive forest cover in the eastern United States, a lot of deforestation for agriculture and grazing lands. And where we are now in the eastern United States is in a period of recovery, where we have all these middle-aged forests that are recovering around this extensive deforestation. But we have these old fields that are intentionally kept open by people. And they might be keeping them open for aesthetic reasons. They like the way they look. They might be keeping them open as hay fields where they can get some bedding hay for animals or other reasons. But we have all these places that really want to be forest that humans are managing to keep open. And what is important is that if we don't manage these forests, if we don't mow them or burn them every couple years, they will start reverting back to forest. And so this is a picture of our Yale Myers educational forest camp. This is the spatial footprint of this old field. And this is what happens. The field crew hasn't gotten out in a couple years to mow or burn this field. And we can already see a really healthy recruitment of some birch trees and a nice under canopy of poison ivy if you really were to look in there, because we aren't actively maintaining this fields. And this is what will happen in a lot of these old field situations in a lot of the eastern United States and a lot of places around the world. And so let's just say hypothetically, we wanted to do an afforestation or reforestation campaign, and we wanted to pay people to grow trees in these fields. We could be doing this for forest climate-based mitigation, but it could also be for growing biomass or biochar or bioenergy or sustainable aviation purposes. But we want to grow a lot more trees, and we want to use these open landscapes. So a question is, well, what do we need to do? What do we need to track the greenhouse gas or the net climate benefits on these? And so to do that, we would need to track all of these different sort of attributional inventory accounting sources of greenhouse gas emissions, which I'm showing in orange, that we would have to, produce trees and drive them to the place and plant them at the site and do some site prep. We also would need to change and track stocks on the landscape. So how the trees and the soil and the wood products are all changing. And this would give us a big picture sort of boundaries of what are the greenhouse gas implications for these tree planting projects. And so let's say we sort of understand what we need to measure and we want to undertake this reforestation campaign in some place like the southeastern United States. And so given the distribution of land ownership, this comes from a paper from an industrial ecologist here, just showing total land area available for planting across the southeastern United States. And let's say we wanted to pay a bunch of landowners who currently had old fields and we wanted them to plant a forest. Maybe it's a monoculture forest, maybe it's a diverse forest. But we could go out and we could just measure those net carbon benefits as we went from a sort of treeless or low tree landscape to a high tree landscape, how much carbon accrues on the landscape as those trees grow. But if we really want to track how effective these payments are at creating larger carbon stocks in the landscape, we don't just need to track what happens on the land. We also need to track what would have happened if we hadn't paid that landowner to grow trees. And so in other words, we need to track how much carbon stocks have changed in that same field in the absence of any carbon payment. And so, like I mentioned before, there's a lot of many possible futures that field could have gone. So some landowners maybe would going to continue mowing that field for a long time, and that's represented in this conceptual diagram by this flat line. No trees, as long as we continue mowing and burning, we're going to have sort of stable carbon stocks. And so the amount that we would credit on this land is this area shown in yellow because we have what we've gained paying the landowner to plant trees relative to what we think would have happened if we hadn't paid that landowner. But there's a lot of context where maybe that wasn't the counterfactual, maybe that wasn't the baseline of what's going to happen. And so maybe for some reason in the future, the landowner decided to stop mowing their fields at some point. Maybe their mower broke and they didn't have the equipment. Maybe their kids took over the landscape and their kids weren't interested in maintaining that old field. And so because of that lack of maintenance, we then have a different sort of counterfactual or baseline scenario, which is demonstrated by this blue line, where we now all of a sudden have trees starting to naturally regenerate on this landscape. And so this becomes a tricky problem in the carbon crediting space because now all of a sudden our baseline has shifted upwards, meaning the amount of additional carbon that our payments have caused fall within this shaded blue area. And if we credit for any of the carbon gained in this yellow area, we then start to say, well, maybe we're over crediting because we would have gained that carbon anyways, because that landowner wasn't going to mow that field in perpetuity, like we said. And so these are all decisions about what might have happened in the future, and they're really crucial because you can see that what baseline you choose really then determines how many carbon credits and what we think the net climate benefit is moving through these projects. And this in itself is the fundamental problem of causal inference. We can never pay a landowner to do something and then observe what would have happened with that one landowner in the absence of the payment. And so there's a lot of issues within making the determination of what is the correct baseline when we can't actually ever observe we cannot do it. We cannot observe what we would ever do. And so there's sort of two important pieces of information to know about this, which is one is that these counterfactuals are unknowable. We'll just never know what's going to happen. But the other thing is that as outside observers, we will always have less information than the landowner has about that. And we call that information asymmetry. So more information that a landowner knows than we could ever know. But I think what's also really important to think about when we talk about these baseline discussions is the landowners also don't even know what they're going to do in the future. They don't necessarily know what the context, what the social or cultural or economic situations are going to be. And so the fact that these counterfactual baselines are unknowable is something that's really important for everyone to understand, that we're always going to be estimating these baselines no matter what we do. And so if we come back to this idea of like, well, what do we need to measure to feel really confident that we're gaining carbon for doing something like paying landowners to plant trees? We actually can't just do this inventory accounting where we just measure all the fluxes or we measure all the stocks and the stock changes, but we actually have to change what we're doing where we're looking at this consequential or impact accounting, where we're actually measuring real gains in real time to some measurable counterfactual. And because we can't ever know this counterfactual, we're always going to have to make assumptions. And so what we really need to be asking ourselves is which assumptions are we comfortable with? And in what situations do these assumptions make the most sense that we have confidence that this counterfactual scenario that we're trying to measure, we are doing our best job at? And this is really the whole crux of a lot of the issues that were coming up in 2020 and 2021 in that John Oliver sketch, or any of these Guardian and Bloomberg sort of expose articles on overcrediting in the carbon credit space, underpinned by a lot of scientific academic peer-reviewed papers claiming overstated carbon emissions, were what is the right baseline? What is the right method for determining the baseline in these studies? Because if you're crediting on this yellow baseline and someone else says, no, 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 this blue baseline is the better baseline, you're going to get charged with overcrediting because someone else has decided there's a better way of estimating that counterfactual. And so we were really interested, and I will highlight that this project could not have moved forward without your own Will Gardner, who, from sort of thinking about how people are approaching the estimates for these baselines to the actual cataloging of reading like dozens and dozens of different crediting protocols to understand what methods people were using. Will was there from the start all the way to the end. But we just wanted to understand what was happening in this space, because these counterfactuals, there's so many different ways that you can do it. And so in this project, which we now have out on pre-parent, led by Megan, a former PhD student in the stat department, actually, we asked sort of three big questions, which is one, how are protocols assessing baseline? So what are we seeing today in sort of these counterfactual assumptions? Do these baseline methods vary by year or forest and activity type? And then what are the underlying assumptions for each of these baseline methods? So we can actually sort of ask those questions of what is the most appropriate way to deal with these baselines. And so when it came down to it, we actually found that there was just sort of three broad categories of the way people were assessing baselines within carbon crediting protocols. And we bin them into either model-based baselines, which the first type of model-based baseline are these historical averages, where we just say whatever was happening in the past, we assume that that's what's going to continue happening in the future. So if you have a land manager that is managing their old field by mowing and burning, we're just going to assume that that management activity is going to go on in the future, where we just take this historical average and we pull it out. And so a key assumption for this is that the past is going to perfectly predict the future, because we just think whatever history is done, that's what's going to go forward. The second kind of baselines, which are also models, the historical average is a really simple model taking an average, are more sophisticated models where maybe you take in environmental conditions or you add in some economic conditions, but you feel that you have some model. It could be a growth and yield model. It could be a growth and yield model tied in with an economic model, but you have some model that you think does a really good job of predicting the future. So if you know the conditions, you can plug in those parameters and you can model out some projected baseline of what you think could happen. And so a lot of protocols use these modeling baselines, which has this assumption that you have this perfect and, importantly, unbiased model that will give you some prediction of the future that you feel confident in. And then the final suite of baselines that are just starting to emerge in the market today are what we call design-based baselines, which are baselines that, instead of doing it ex ante, or before, when you're trying to predict out the future before it happens, where you actually are observing what happens on the landscape in real time by taking your project site and matching it with other similar areas that could have received the payment but didn't. And then you actually just measure what happens in real time across all of the sites. And this is a really common approach that are used in a lot of different causal inference fields like political science and epidemiology, but they also come with their own assumptions. And these are a lot of the approaches that came out in those articles in the 2020s looking at overcrediting for forest carbon spaces. And one of the main assumptions that is really important to remember for these design-based is that you need to have perfect matches. If you're going to compare what you did to what other folks are doing, then you need to feel really confident that those things that you're comparing are actually a good comparison. And so these perfect matches are things that people are starting to talk about in the carbon crediting space, but are a real limitation that come with a lot of assumptions that we need to start thinking about. And so when we looked across about 40 different protocols that were crediting for things like avoided conversion, afforestation, reforestation, and improved forest management, we actually didn't find any patterns at all in terms of just the number of protocols and the type of approach that they used. We saw, generally matching was less used, but historical averages and modeling were pretty popular across current contemporary protocols. What we did see was a really strong signal that if we split the protocols by the year that they were either published or updated, so we just looked at the most recent versions of the protocols, that matching methods were almost exclusively coming up in the newer protocols. And so this just demonstrated that the market was responding and shifting to these new ideas about ways of calculating baselines and using these matching methods. And so it's nice to sort of see that evolution and response and to remind ourselves that these markets are continually evolving. But I think really the obvious question is, people want to say which baseline is best. And at least for me, I'm not going to do that because I don't think there probably is a best baseline answer sort of caveat across the board. And I think it's partially because this is actually not a science question. It's a policy question about evaluating our assumptions and also making sure that we have what data streams we need to actually implement different baselines. Because we can unpack this more in the Q&A, but we need different data streams to create these different baselines. And there's many contexts and scenarios around the world where that data doesn't exist or it becomes almost infeasible to collect the data at the scale that we need. And so instead, I want to take these sort of key assumptions and start thinking about, well, are there places where certain assumptions are more likely to hold than others? And so this is sort of I'm now actually departing from the great paper that Megan wrote, but sort of just thinking about where do we might think that we might see forests that meet these assumptions. And so I think for something like historical averages, where we're making this assumption that whatever's happened in the past is going to predict the future, where might that be held? And so maybe that's in places what we would call high forest, low deforestation nations. So these are nations that have had pretty continuous cover. This is showing a map. There's tropical nations where deforestation is just not as great as places as we've seen in the past. And so maybe under those nations that have remained mostly free of deforestation, this historical average makes a lot of sense for continuing that as a baseline, especially for some of these jurisdictional carbon crediting models. Likewise, these models that we build, these environmental or environmental economic linear models or growth and yield models that we build, where we have this assumption that we have this perfect and unbiased model, I think there's a lot to say that perhaps commercial monoculture plantations, where we have extensive management plans, where we have a lot of expertise on how the forests grow and how quickly they grow, and we have a lot of data existing because these foresters are collecting lots of data to understand how to best grow these trees to yield carbon products. I think probably actually that it's pretty good for commercial monoculture plantations to rely on these models, because I think as perfect as models can be, those might be a source. But I think for especially if we're talking about like planting out private small family landowner fields for afforestation, or a lot of distant forests where there's a lot of social and cultural and economic contexts that are underlying and underpinning what landowners or land managers are doing, that those forests, it might actually make a lot of sense to start adapting and moving towards these matching protocols, where instead of trying to guess what people are doing, we instead try to say, well, let's see what other people are doing in real time to match. And so that concludes sort of this project that we have thinking about baselines and additionality. And so I want to shift to sort of a different project working in the ag space, but really trying to sort of now, instead of just looking at baselines and additionality, thinking about, well, how do we look across a whole protocol, which is actually making a series of assumptions, not just on the baselines, but on what we expect in these measurements and estimates. And so there's a lot of groups that are working, like the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, that have developed these core carbon principles that are really emphasizing what we want to see in these protocols. And again, not just for thinking about baselines and additionality, but sort of across the entire spectrum of impact. And so we thought that one potential way to evaluate how these projects are doing is through the use of something that we're calling a protocol intercomparison project. project where we allow for direct comparisons of all the different assumptions that are happening within these protocols by taking one scenario and mapping it out across all the different protocols that we could use to find it. And so this is really similar to the concept of model intercomparison projects, or MIPS, which happens in the climate space a lot, where we know we have all of these climate models that are projecting out different future climate scenarios, but we know all of them are making all these assumptions and they're slightly wrong. And so what we can do is combine and compare all these different model projects to try to see, well, where do we find confidence that these assumptions underpinning these protocols make a lot of sense? And so just like we do this model intercomparison work with our climate modeling, we think there's a lot of benefit to do that with these protocol intercomparison projects, where we can look at relative strengths and weaknesses of assumptions that different protocols are making. And so this was a collaborative project that I'm going to present that we worked with the Environmental Defense Fund on, where we looked at farmland data from corn and soy row crops, or we actually had to create our own database. And we took that data and we ran it through 3 of the major accrediting protocols at the time, Climate Action Reserve, Verra, and NORI, to estimate how many carbon credits we would get out of the same data set. And so our goal was really to assess whether, starting with this sort of same suite of corn and soy fields, we would arrive at the same number if we applied these different protocols across the board to see what happens. And we called this, we created this term, the equivalency assumption, because when we're generating these carbon credits, we're really thinking that we're generating a ton of CO2 as a fungible commodity that we want to sell. And so we are inherently saying that regardless of the different assumptions made across these protocols and how we're estimating carbon gains, they should really all be generating this equivalent carbon credit that's a similar thing. And so this is not, equivalency assumption is not something that I think people talk about a lot, but it is embedded within sort of like the very core of carbon markets. And so to start this project, we actually were unable to find a data set that fit what we needed, a fit to purpose data set. We talked with a lot of different folks and a lot of from government agencies and private corporations, but we found that we didn't actually have a data set that did exactly what we wanted, which was a map of a bunch of farm fields with all the relevant environmental and carbon and soil data. And so we actually had to compile our own synthetic data set using sort of a bunch of different publicly available data sources. And so this project was led by a postdoc named Lisa Ish, who spent a lot of time creating this really wonderful data set that we now have online that's about 5,000 corn and soy fields scattered across these 6 Midwestern states. And we use this data set as the base data for sort of understanding. And so this is not real data. The projects and the numbers that we're going to present are not real numbers. They're not projections of what could happen under different management regimes. They're really just a test of the assumptions within these protocols to see if we get the same numbers. And so what we then did was, with this data, we ran it through these 3 different protocols, NORI, Climate Action Reserve, and Verra, and we found, different assumptions along the way in additionality, like what I was talking about in the prior project, and models and measurements of how these protocols modeled and measured carbon gains, how they tracked and accounted for uncertainty, and then what they did with reversals. And so I'm going to walk you through step by step of how these different assumptions within these protocols sort of pan out. And so I'm going to first just orient you to this graph and then start filling this in here, which is the main finding. So on our y-axis, we have the number of carbon credits generated by a protocol in terms of tons of CO2 equivalent per year. And we can look at credits generated just for soil organic carbon, credits generated for emissions reductions for nitrous oxide, and then the total issued credits. And what we ended up doing, because the market is changing so rapidly, that when we started this project, many of the protocols that we looked at had already done an updated version. So we also did updated versions where we looked at 2 suites of protocols for each of the crediting agencies, from what we call a historical version, which was pre-2021, and an updated version, which was 2022 or later. Okay. So one of the first major areas of divergence across these protocols were how they looked at additionality. And while all of them had this sort of requirement that new practices started after that the landowner had to adopt a new practice, they weren't going to credit for practices that were already happening on the landscape. They all differed in the use of this common practice test, which is this idea that we only want to credit for practices that are uncommon in a region, because if they're really common, we sort of assume everyone's going to end up doing them anyways. But Nori didn't use the common practice test at all. And Carr and Vera had these different sort of adoption thresholds that they used, where Carr was looking at less than 50% adoption at the county level. So within a county, if more than 50% of growers were adopting, and sorry, I didn't say the practices we were considering were reduced or no tillage and addition of cover crops. So if we had report, so if the percentage adoption was too high, greater than 50% at the county level, a field couldn't enroll in Carr's protocol. And Vera had like a larger geographic scope. They were looking at adoption levels at the state, and they then had a lower adoption threshold. So less than 20% adoption for a given state. And so we can look at what that does. Sorry, sometimes this. There we go. We can sort of look at what happens. This is a map. This shows we started out with this data set of 5,000 fields that all had historical management practices in there. And we can see that just using these additionality requirements, Nori drops to about 3,000 fields, because a lot of the fields were already adopting one or both practices. And this is just for the adoption of reduced or no tillage. But we get these really like vast differences with these different common practice thresholds, where we go from a large number of fields being eligible to enroll for Nori to 0 fields meeting the eligibility threshold for Vera. So Vera had this like very strict and conservative common practice test that ended up meaning that no fields within our region, at least within our synthetic data set, were eligible for crediting. What was really interesting and sort of wild is all of these protocols allow managers to stack practices on their fields. And so the way the stacking rules worked meant that because cover cropping is a relatively rarely adopted practice, when you applied the credit stacking practice rules, we all of a sudden had the surge of fields that were eligible for carbon crediting when they weren't eligible under just conservation tillage, because of the way these protocols do their stacking rules. And so when we look at playing out, just looking at the impact of whether fields are eligible or not to generate carbon credits, we can see this huge, we can see this sort of 2 big things that pop out. One, for our conservation tillage, we see that Vera is issuing no credits because they had no fields that were eligible. But if the grower stacked practices, we had large number of credits. And so what this is showing is that these assumptions about even just the use of a test like the common practice test and what that common practice threshold is require some upfront sort of consideration. And there's really not a lot of research out there guiding protocols as to what makes a practice common or not, like where you are on the adoption curve, what makes a lot of sense. And so we can see that the application of these different thresholds can have really different crediting outcomes when they're not underpinned by any kind of guiding research to sort of design and say what the correct threshold should be. When we looked at how these protocols were doing models and measurements, we actually found they used really similar methods. They were all using dynamic baselines, and they were all using some version of a model, a biogeochemical model, plus with some sampling within. And so this part of the standardized modeling created a sort of standardized where everyone was using models. We just applied one model in our analysis, and there is a possibility to get lots of different deviations from using different biogeochemical models or using different versions of models, which we did not test in our study. But we also found that there was a lot of deviations in the greenhouse gas accounting boundaries. So what kind of carbon gains protocols were looking for. So Nori, when it was issuing credits, was only issuing soil organic carbon credits. It wasn't issuing any emission reduction credits, while Carr and Vera were expanding beyond just soil organic carbon to looking at emissions reductions from either nitrous oxide or methane. We also saw that there was a huge difference in the way that these protocols were docking for uncertainty within their modeling and also their carbon sampling. And so when we put that together, these green bars represent the different uncertainty deductions that each of the protocols were gained from, again, the same data set. We can see sort of two interesting patterns, which is one, how the uncertainty deductions were applied were leading to way different deductions between protocols. But we also saw this really interesting pattern where the protocols actually had this major shift between the historical and the updated versions into how they were estimating their uncertainty. And so we saw, using the exact same data, that under the historical protocols, there were these huge uncertainty deductions. But just using the new protocols, we had fewer uncertainty deductions and then more issued credits, sort of on the same underlying data. And again, this is just from a statistical procedure and how the protocols decided to do uncertainty. Again, not really guided by a strong evidence base because there hasn't been a lot of scientific evidence looking at what are the correct statistical procedures for accounting for uncertainty given sort of certain suites of data. So I can't tell you, again, whether these are conservative or not uncertainty adjustments, but I can say that like as protocols adjust and change, it does make big differences in the crediting outcomes coming out. And what we can see here for nitrous oxide is that under the historical versions, under our project area, there'd be no crediting for any emissions reductions for nitrous oxide based on model results because the model uncertainty was too high. But using the same model in the same field, we do then start to see some emission reduction credits coming out just because of this change in the statistical approach. And so finally, the last thing that we looked at is all of these protocols pull out credits that they call for buffers. And these are to account for sort of unforeseen, what they call reversal events, where carbon is potentially lost back to the atmosphere, maybe because in the forest space, a wildfire moves through or some unintended disturbance happens on the landscape. And so there's a lot of variation in how many buffer credits these different protocols were pulling out to cover for reversal risks. And so again, there's not a lot of guidance on what is the right amount of credits to pull aside, what is the risk to these soil carbon stocks for future disturbances, to know whether these buffers are good contributions or not. But what we can see is that we just get very different both between the historical and the updated versions of the protocols, but also between our different crediting bodies withholding certain different numbers of credits. And so when we pull all this together and we sort of look across all these assumptions these protocols are making, we see that you can see really strong differences using the same data set, but just following different methods, different numbers in the total issued credits. And so this is just showing the total credits that would have gone out into the market under this hypothetical scenario. But one thing we can see is we see, a nearly 60% difference in crediting because of just these different assumptions under the historical versions. But we also see this sort of trend, which I think is interesting because I think protocols are, learning from one another, that in the updated versions, these differences in crediting disappear. And it has to do with how protocols are changing these sort of minute technical rules that are happening within them to where on the updated versions, you're actually getting the same number of credits coming out. But what's really important is the assumptions that led to these carbon credits coming out on the back end are very different. So different path leading to the same crediting space. And so we just thought this was a really powerful approach that really helped us hone in on where are protocols making assumptions and where could scientific research really come in to help support some of these assumptions or to provide guidance. And so we sort of bend our key areas of future research into places where we thought there could be potential for overcrediting and things like this additionality with the practice stacking rules. Are we seeing more credits coming out because people are allowed to stack their practices and then gain carbon credits for practices that are not actually additional? Nori is no longer operating in the market space, so it actually closed its doors while we were publishing this study. But greenhouse gas accounting boundaries can make a huge difference in the number of credits coming out. And if you're not accounting for those other emissions in the agricultural land space, you could be overcrediting depending on what the activity type and what it is. And then there's just huge questions about whether these buffer pools are allocated correctly because we don't actually know what the risks to soil carbon stocks are moving forward. There's been more research in the forest space, but a lot less in the soil carbon space. We also think there's a lot of decisions people are making on sort of these threshold values, like what is the right common practice threshold, or what is the right threshold for an uncertainty deduction that we want to see. And so protocols are really sort of like going blind in terms of what decisions they're making and how they're going. And then finally, we did all this on synthetic data, and the reviewers had big problems with our synthetic data set because they were really unhappy that it wasn't real and that we couldn't give them a real number. But we really felt that after doing a lot of work that these data sets just don't exist. And so what we would really like to see is more transparency within even the government collects a lot of data that's unavailable to share and to learn from. And so there's lots of places where increased transparency, I think, could help with a lot of these decision makings. Okay, so I know I tacked too much on, so I'm at 15 minutes and starting to get into my Q&A, but I just want to share a couple things that's a newer project that Kira is on that I think will be of interest to this audience, where we're really interested in looking at measuring carbon benefits from stacking these different nature-based solutions. And so just like really broadly, I've been talking a lot about afforestation and soil carbon sequestration, but there's a whole realm of activities that the IPCC and lots of other folks are working on of ways to capture carbon and store it, whether it's within ecosystems or within geological foundations. And so we have a whole team of research at Yale that's looking at enhanced weathering, of applying silicate rocks to the landscape to enhance the weathering process and to absorb more carbon dioxide. And so just really briefly, this process is really taking on this like geological process that happens over millennia, where we have weathering and erosion of rocks that creates bicarbonates that then get put into oceans, where they eventually will cycle through, and if they make it to the magma, come back up in the lava stage. But this is a natural process that regulates carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. And so there's an idea that perhaps we can enhance this by actually crushing up some of these volcanic rocks that create these bicarbonate substrates when they interact with acidic rainwater to pull down and draw down more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, storing it eventually in ocean carbon pools. And so we were interested, and Kira is really interested in, well, what happens if we start to stack these practices? So what happens if we take something like enhanced weathering and we add it to a reforestation campaign? Do we see synergistic carbon benefits when we do this together? And so what we're working on right now is just understanding sort of the mechanistic process of how are ectomycorrhizal fungi enhancing tree growth and how are ectomycorrhizal fungi enhancing rock weathering rates. And when we put all those together, do we see synergies within what's going on? And so Kara has this nice greenhouse study going on right now in one of our greenhouses, where we've done a basalt application where we're measuring soil and organic carbon from this rock weathering rates, where we've added ectomycorrhizal fungi to our trees, and where we've added both to look at different organic and inorganic processes to see mechanistically, do we see gains in either of these pathways along with just tree growth. And so just, to say, why do we think that the fungi are a really important piece to this? Well, one, we know from a long body of research, including Martina on this call, that these ectomycorrhizal fungi do enhance tree growth. And so when you have different pine trees growing in places where there's either naturally occurring populations of fungi or fungi is added, we see much higher growth rates than in places where we don't have the fungi. We also have this growing evidence base that these fungi might actually be increasing these rock weathering rates, whether it's through sort of physical processes where the hyphae are tunneling into and breaking up those rock pieces, creating more surface area for weathering to happen, or whether it has to do with chemical changes in the soil where we're getting reduced pH, which should then enhance the weathering process. And so Kira has this nice block design where we've added different nutrients, basalt and ectomycorrhizal fungi to these white pine seedlings. And she's measuring both the tree's growth and then also the leachate and that inorganic carbon coming out of the soils. These are just some field pictures where we inoculated the soils, going out and collecting soils at our research forest up at Yale. We're happy to report that our pine inoculant soils have a lot more ectomycorrhizal fungi than our base soils, just sort of proof of concept that we were able to inoculate with ectomycorrhizal fungi. And just some preliminary results that Kira just pulled together for me. We have found that weathering rates are higher with the basalt addition. So in the basalt or both the basalt and the fungi addition, we are seeing higher inorganic carbon coming out, sort of showing that the fungi are doing something to enhance these inorganic carbon rates relative to our control pots, which had no basalt and no fungi. But we are not seeing differences in tree growth at this point. We're about 25 weeks into the experiment. The trees still have a lot more space to grow, so we're going to be running this for a lot longer. So perhaps we'll see differences in tree growth, but I know you guys were involved in Bonnie Waring's field trials, where she also was looking in a field trial setting, just measuring above ground tree growth rate, where also the same experiment out in the field did not find notable differences in above ground tree carbon stock. So it's potentially that, perhaps that we're not seeing the enhancements and that synergistic interaction that we want to see, but we, at least because we're doing a pot experiment, have the luxury that we will be able to destructively harvest these trees at the end of the experiment. And we will actually be able to look at root growth too, to see if there's differences between root growth and shoot growth across these different treatments. And then we'll also look at just any soil organic carbon gains from the soil within the pots. And so this is an ongoing study. I just wanted to spotlight for Kira because I felt like this was something that you all probably have a lot of good information about. So apologies, I went way longer than you wanted, but happy to entertain questions for the next 10 minutes. I will, whoops, figure out how to exit, stop share. Great. Cool. Thanks for all your virtual claps.
Okay, we can get started. We have one question so far, so it's the one we will get started with. Thank you, Sarah. Awesome presentation. Always, it's cool to hear what people have gotten up to since I left. It remains exciting.
Yeah.
David asked, actually, David, do you want to come off mute and just ask a question?
Sure, thank you. My question was, what were some of the parameters you were looking for but found unavailable for that ag field model?
Yeah, I think the primary data that's the hardest to get, and if you talk to folks who are doing the carbon crediting, it's management data. And this I will say, like, put in a plug for these like matching methods for baselines. If you're going to use biogeochemical models to project out carbon gains, both in your project site and for your baseline, those models require a slew of historical management data for the site to get the models, what they would say, initiated up to an initial carbon stock. And so management data layered on top of, and management data is like, what's been your crop rotation for the past 15 years? Were you doing corn, corn, soy, corn, corn, or were you doing corn, 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 soy? And then that has to be matched up with environmental data, which is easy to access. But just in general, there's like not a ton of comprehensive data sets across a lot of different agricultural fields. So, right, we have like universities who do these small trial field sites, where they collect a lot of intensive data, and they'll, break up a field into strips or into plots, and then they collect all the different data, the nutrient data, the carbon data, the management history data. But it's on these subplots within fields. And these carbon credit projects are not crediting fields. They're crediting like hundreds to thousands of fields at a time, because that's the sample size you need to run those models. And so a data set of that like spatial scale with the historical management data plus all the different environmental data like doesn't exist in the public sphere in a way that's useful for this.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Go Vols.
Martine?
Yes, yeah. Awesome talk. Also, awesome. This is like really important, Sarah. It's amazing to see this research. I have a question on your last project. Like, so
Yeah.
you have pines growing with and without ectomycorrhiza?
With or without, we used to probably not without ectomycorrhiza totally because they are growing, Martine. But the base soil we collected just from like a mixed hardwood forest stand and then in the forest. So it probably does have some ectomycorrhizal in there. It wasn't coming up in that. And Kira, you should jump in if you
Yeah.
want. And then we inoculated with soil that we collected in a pine stand within the forest. And that
Hmm.
inoculant had, like, that was the green section of the bar, had a much higher proportion of ectomycorrhizal funga relative to the base
Yeah.
soil. But I don't think it's without. It'd be like planting a tree in a pine stand, a pine seedling in a pine stand versus
Mm-hmm.
planting a pine seedling in a mixed hardwood forest that has lower density pines and a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah, because pines most trees are like pretty good at finding these like spores and associating with them. I was curious why you didn't use a non ectogarcial species, say I don't know there are many trees that are not ectos that so for the comparison.
Yeah, I'm looking at Kira and
Yeah,
you
I can hop
give
in
me.
here.
I think it was
Great.
partially availability of buying hundreds of seedlings at low cost, and white pine was one of the ones that was available. But Kira, were there other
Yeah,
thoughts?
we chose white pine because it's an early successional species common on old fields. I know Sarah talked a little bit about old field reforestation in the beginning of this talk. And so that was kind of an aim for you coupling these two CDR approaches for restoration on old fields in the New England region. As opposed to like if we were going to co-deploy these things in the southeast, we'd be more interested in loblolly pine or some of these other different species.
Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Thank you.
But yeah, thanks, Martine. Give us more thoughts, Martine, offline as you think about it.
While we're on the topic of the final of the three studies, Justin, do you want to quickly ask your mechanistic question? And then we'll pop to
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Phil. Yeah, Sarah and Kira, thanks. Really interesting to kind of see some of these greenhouse results. I guess, one question that jumps to mind for me is, these are interesting results when you put it in the context of some of the Hubbard Brook work and just kind of how much this is going to tell us about, whether this is kind of more acidification recovery that we see within the Northeast, or I'm out here in the PNW, we have a lot of alder turnover. And so we deal with kind of, that naturally acidifying soil out here, as well as kind of some of the phosphorus limitation work, some of the stuff that came out of Goucher with some of the kind of the larger modeling studies. So maybe it's kind of a continued conversation. I'd be interested to maybe kind of follow up offline. But yeah, just kind of first reactions as far as I know you're looking at it more from like an EM type of perspective, but what is this kind of telling you from kind of what we've seen up there in the Northeast as far as ERW within kind of forested ecosystems?
Yeah, I can definitely hop in here. That study was one of the several things that formed the basis of this work. And the reason that I decided to apply fertilizer to half of the block is to try to figure out if this is a nutrient-driven phenomenon or I'm trying to figure out like when do the fungi attack the rock grains versus just sourcing nutrients from more readily available pools like a nitrogen phosphorus fertilizer. And right now, since I'm not seeing any statistically significant differences in the biomass across all 8 different treatments, I can't comment yet. Hopefully the seedlings will start growing more. Or my greater suspicion is that we're seeing a lot of below ground growth. And I'll be able to comment once we destructively sample all of our trees. So stay tuned.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. And if you haven't seen, I think there's a new Bernhardt study that followed on. I'll send you the paper. And so they talk about some of that soil carbon shifts. So yeah, thanks. Interested to see it published. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, Justin.
Tylen. 30 seconds for your question, 30 seconds to answer, and then I'll wrap up on the top
All right.
For the great talk, sir. Then my question is for the soil carbon for first project, especially for reforestation and afforestation. I think currently most measure trees them same, but for reforestation from the deforested area, within 10 years, even you plant a tree, they are still carbon source. Then I want to see your opinion about this, especially soil carbon loss.
Sorry, on soil carbon loss in reforestation
Yes.
campaigns.
Yeah.
I don't think I have enough of an information to. It probably depends a lot on like what the site treatment was on like the impacts on the soil of like how intensive was the site treatment in how they planted the trees to then track soil carbon
Yeah.
loss. But how
Um,
that
yeah, the
how
soil
that
carbon loss a lot. Yeah. I did this kind of research. Then within 10 years, they are still carbon source. Yeah. Then we also claim carbon removal for the reforestation project. Yeah. Then,
yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I agree. If you've had some intensive soil prep to plant the trees, then you probably are seeing soil carbon losses in some initial time period. I wouldn't say that all, I mean, I used to do a lot of tree planting with the Nature Conservancy, and we had very low survival. I'm not sure it was, the best way, but we were digging tiny holes with Boy Scouts and, putting tiny trees in the ground. And I don't think we probably saw a lot of soil carbon loss in those. But I mean, it's a good point. It's, what carbon pools are being measured. If you're not measuring the soil carbon pool and you're just assuming no change under certain contexts and conditions, you might be missing like large amounts of emissions in
yeah.
early years. But I don't know enough about the afforestation or reforestation protocols to comment specifically on
Yeah. I'm
the
revising the protocol now.
Yeah. No.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for your questions and round of applause and thanks to Sarah for taking the time to speak to all of us and share her research and her research group's YASP's research with the Funga team and everyone who is interested in joining. So thanks very much for taking the time. We really appreciate it.